colleagues, allow me to introduce to you now Dr. Anthony Gewer. Anthony has for the past 21 years provided strategic and technical support to government, donors, industry and institutions around strengthening pathways for successful youth labour market transitions. During this time, he has worked with leading NGOs in the areas of vocational skills development and youth employability. He is currently Program Manager in Economic Inclusion at the National Business Initiative, responsible for the Installation, Repair and Maintenance Initiative, a national program to expand opportunities for marginalized youth across the formal and township economy. Through his extensive work in TVET and skills development, Anthony has designed interventions to address employment-orientated curriculum, institutional management, teaching and learning, and workplace learning. He has written and presented extensively on labour market transitions and youth employability in a developing context. He has a PhD in educational policy with a specific focus on vocational education and the transition from school to work. Anthony, thank you very much for affording us your time. Please take the stand.
Thanks, everyone. I really have to shorten that bio. So obviously with complex problems comes complex solutions. It's not easy. I mean, and some of the questions that we've already raised, point to the complexity of the challenges that we're dealing with. And there's no short-term fixes. But there's also not, like, you can't approach these things narrowly. I mean, we sit with a problem in our country. The unemployment crisis is not a function of a situation today. It's a function of a process that started many years and has continued and persisted and got worse. And if we're going to fundamentally address this challenge, we have to look at these things holistically. We have to look at them systemically. We can't look at them in isolation. So just addressing skills or putting more young people through TVET or higher education is not solving the problem. We've got to solve the problem on the demand side. We've got to grow opportunities on the demand side. And so this program tries to look at it from both perspectives. And I think it ties very nicely into Zinni's input. So hybrid events are still a novel concept. So we believe there's two fundamental principles, I suppose, in trying to address this problem. One is that a notion of a just transition. If we're going to achieve just transition, we have to give practical expression. It's an abstract concept until you give practical expression to it. We need to fundamentally analyze, diagnose, and understand what are the challenges that are sitting in our labor market that are preventing young people from making such successful transitions. And then we have to address the interface between our supply side, the TVET system, and the post-schooling system more broadly, and that labor market situation. And that's what we've got to try and achieve. So, no, not happening. Let's try it this way. That's fine. Oh, I've got to go down. Yes. Okay. I always think you've got to go up to go forward. All right, so this IRM strategy, but the basic principle is that on the one side, you've got to increase the demand for skills and jobs. And traditionally, I think, as Zinni has already pointed out, we turn to our formal sector and we turn to our large companies to try and address demand. And it's not happening. We've been trying for years. We've been plowing away at trying to increase artisan training. We use learnerships. We use all of these sorts of mechanisms to try and grow jobs. Doesn't work. We're sitting in the same situation that we were 20 years ago. It's got worse. The economy is obviously stagnating, so large companies are not training more than they need to train. So they train for their own purposes, which is understandable. And apprenticeships and learnerships don't solve our problem because the large majority of young people out there don't get access to them. So even if we were training, whatever the big number we put in the NDP, which is meaningless actually, we're still not going to crack this thing because we're getting 1 million young people coming out of the education system each year. The challenge is bigger than just training 20 or 15,000 artisans, sort of thing. So we need to increase demand, which means we need to focus on where the opportunities are, and they're not in the large formal companies. The opportunities sit more effectively in the SME environment. But we know that in many of the trades that we focus on, in this sphere, the majority of these SMEs are informal, operating in the informal economy. They're not creating jobs, typically. They're one-person shows, or they might, provide some contract work for one or two young people. But fundamentally, they sit there, they operate on the periphery, but they don't move, right? They're stagnant. In that mix, we believe there's a lot of entrepreneurial potential, and we've got to find it. If we can find the entrepreneurs, particularly in your informal economy and your township economy, if we can find those entrepreneurs and we can support those entrepreneurs to grow, we can create more demand for skills. Getting businesses to grow cannot just happen organically. It requires a whole set of circumstances that you need to, or conditions that we need to put in place to enable businesses, to enable SMEs to grow, and to become sustainable and to be able to create jobs. And that's the conditions that we're trying to create. So we've got to find the SMEs, we've got to find these entrepreneurs, right? And we've got to search, wide and deep to find those entrepreneurs and help them to get on a pathway. We've got to create the conditions locally at an ecosystem level where those entrepreneurs can thrive. Right? We talk about it in terms of entrepreneurial ecosystems. We've got to link it to where there's demand, where's the industrial activity happening, where are there opportunities. And you saw on that first picture, you've got a township sitting here in a big, center of commerce right next door, and the two don't meet. Right? Now, that's just a sort of a microcosm of the situation. We've heard earlier this morning about eco-industrial parks, revitalization of industrial parks, SEZs and the like. Those are all opportunities for immediate demand. How are the communities that are sitting around those parks, that are sitting around these centers of industry and commerce, how are they sitting, how are they benefiting? How are SMEs being uplifted and being brought into those opportunities from those communities around there? We're going through a process of setting up, and Zinni spoke about enterprise and skills hubs, IRM hubs. And the purpose of these hubs is to try and crowd in as much support as you can to those SMEs, right? To help them to get on access markets, to help them get on a growth trajectory, to get them to a point where they are sustainable. And through doing that, create opportunities for young people to be trained and employed in those very SMEs that you're working with. And that's the purpose of the hubs, right? We work very closely with our TVET colleges as the mechanisms through which we can position the interface between the supply and the demand for skills. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then we need to incentivize those entrepreneurs. So what is in it for the entrepreneur? Why do they want to participate? We've got to get them to see the long-term benefit. And if they are entrepreneurial, they will, right? So they've got to be able to upskill their workforce, they've got to increase productivity, and they've got to take on TVET students. These are all mechanisms that will help them on their growth trajectory. So if we can do that, then we expand the base of workplaces. We're no longer reliant just on large companies. We're not even just reliant on formal SMEs, right? We're now spreading the load and making sure that in our broader labor market, we can open more workplaces that can train and employ young people. And that's that's going to solve the problem. But to do that, we're solving a problem that's been in creation for many, many years. We've got to shift the structure in the economy. We've got to get more informal SMEs, more township-based SMEs to participate in the economy in a way that's in a growth-oriented and sustainable sort of way. That's how we solve the problem of jobs. Because if we don't have demand for skills, we can train everyone we want. They're never going to get jobs. Right. So that's on the demand side. On the supply side, we need to strengthen the delivery of skills that are aligned to the demands of these SMEs that we're working with, right? Both formal and informal. So we need to provide the right kinds of skills, which means they need to be more agile, more flexible, more demand-driven, but they still must offer a pathway. So these are alternative pathways to qualifications outside of the formal apprenticeship and learnership system, right? So we can expand the pathways. We can use SMEs as workplaces that can train more young people, get them on a pathway towards becoming an artisan one day, for example, if they so wish, but doing it through a different route because we can't afford to train more artisans and we don't have enough workplaces. And SMEs can't train artisans anyway, not in the traditional way. It's too expensive, it's too cumbersome, and they don't have the capacity. So how do we make it easier for SMEs to train? That's the basic principle here. From the supply side point of view, if we want more young people to get workplace learning, we need to make it easier for SMEs to train. So we're tackling both the demand side in terms of the demand for skills and the supply side in terms of how we train. And we focus on both the workers that are already working in those SMEs, and those, again, formal and informal. How do we upskill workers, give them formal recognition? Because what we don't want to do is push young people into those businesses that are better qualified than the workers that are already in those businesses and push them out, just exacerbate the problem. So we need to upskill workers, give them formal recognition for their skills, and then get more unemployed youth through an integrated program of skills with work readiness, with entrepreneurial education, etc., into these businesses. And I'll come back to that a little bit, and I'll go down. Okay, so there's three interfacing strategic priorities here, and they're all aligned to kind of growth sectors in the economy. The one is infrastructure development and maintenance, and that's where the IRM program focuses. So we know that across the country there's a ton of infrastructure, and we can look out the window and see it over the mountains there, over the hills. There's tons of infrastructure, office buildings, retail parks, industrial nodes, whether it's industrial parks, SEZs, hotels, domestic, public infrastructure, schools, clinics, a whole range. It's tons and tons of infrastructure out there that needs to be maintained, right? That needs to be improved. Because we have a big problem where our infrastructure is failing, and we just have to see on the public side with our current power crisis, water crises, there's infrastructure that's falling apart. We know, right? So how do we use that as an opportunity to create jobs? That's the first part. Through supply chains, through in your value chains. The second part is the green economy, because if you're going to sustain infrastructure, you've got to do it through sustainable mechanisms, right? You've got to use efficient ways, more resource efficient ways of developing and maintaining infrastructure. You've got to use green building practices or principles. You've got to use greater focus on the efficient use of energy, water, waste, etc. All of these sorts of things. So, and then you've got to use renewable energy to power those buildings, and all of these sorts of things. So that's the second component. And then the third component is a focus on industrialization and localization, because we know that a lot of the demand is going to come from industrial activity at a local level. So down the road here, I can't get my bearings where we are, is your Tshwane Automotive SEZ, one of the biggest construction things in this country since I think the Soccer World Cup, right? Massive construction. Ford has put up a big components manufacturing plant there. That's industrial activity. There's massive construction. There's a lot of contractors from that area, particularly like the Mamelodi area, that are going to get benefit. So we're going to put a hub right there in Mamelodi, and we're going to help those enterprises and young people to benefit from that work that's happening around the establishment of that SEZ. Similarly, in Mandeni, of all places, that you wouldn't automatically think about, on the north coast of KZN, you have the Esitebe Industrial Park, which is the biggest industrial park in this country. It's fallen into complete, as we mentioned this morning, but is now being transformed into, hopefully, into an eco-industrial park. How do the communities of Mandeni and the surrounds and the youth benefit from that, right? Similarly in Atlantis, and in Cape Town, and in East London, and where's other places. And we spoke yesterday, 5,700 industrial parks across the country. That's a lot of industrial activity. And there's a lot of infrastructure there that needs to be maintained. The biggest pain point for many of these industrial players, they can't get basic services, right? They don't get water, they don't get power. How do you run a business? when municipal services are falling apart. So there's infrastructure that makes it easier for those industries to actually operate. And then those industries themselves need these kinds of services. They need plumbers, they need electricians, they need various types of maintenance services for their plants. And we're working currently with SAPI in Mandeni, where they're taking SMEs in these IRM occupations. So artisans, it's another way of talking about artisans, but we don't only limit it to artisan trades, because we know that in the green economy, there's a whole lot of new stuff that's not about artisan trades. There's a whole lot of new stuff in the 4-hour space and whatever that is not about artisan trades. You use your artisanal skills and your artisanal knowledge in some way, but you don't have to be a qualified artisan necessarily to do that work. So that's why we don't only talk about artisans, because in this country we have a very narrow conception of what is an artisan. But what we have is a broader sense of artisanal skills that you can use for various sorts of purposes, some of which is to be an artisan. So alignment of our work to sectoral and local industrial development plans, including this revitalization work that's happening around the industrial parks and the eco-industrial parks, etc. And in this zone of opportunity within this infrastructure value chain, you're looking both at construction maintenance, which is your typical sort of trade skills, right? Plumbing, tiling, drywalling, etc., ceilings, glazing, painting, and all of that, with a strong focus on sustainable practices and energy efficiency and the like, as well as the maintenance of the electronic and digital stuff that runs that infrastructure, because all of the infrastructure that we have is run off, electronics and digital equipment and the like. We have even smart, systems in different buildings. We have, buildings can't really operate without equipment. So how do we tie these two things in? And we talk about sources or buckets of demand. Like, where are we going to find this demand? So there's 5, give or take, areas of demand. The one is the construction industry. So working with the construction industry around meaningful township contract. I'm trying to move as quickly as I can. I'm getting signals. Township contractor development linked to the construction industry. So TASES is a good example of that, and other sorts of things. The Tshwane Automotive SEZ. How do we work around with the construction industry to make sure the township contractors are getting proper support to benefit from those opportunities? Public infrastructure, maintenance of schools and clinics and other community centres and the like at municipal and provincial level. Industrial development nodes, which are also linked to public infrastructure because of the 5,700 owned by government alone, but we separate out those two to some extent. Private commercial maintenance through office buildings, retail, hotels, and these sort of things. And then your insurance industry, because there's a lot of repair work needed in domestic, industrial, commercial spaces that is funded through the insurance industry. How are township artisans, township SMEs benefiting from those opportunities? That's the broad sense if you look at it. And then there's the domestic market itself. Customers in the domestic market that require people to maintain and repair their houses. It's a big scope, right? So we need to exploit it completely. Now, we do believe that we can position TVET colleges at the heart of this entrepreneurial ecosystem. So if you think about Mamelodi, think about Atlantis or Mandeni, there's a TVET college campus. How do we position those TVET colleges to support entrepreneurial activity and manage the interface between supply and demand? And that's multi-layered. Because on the one hand, you've got to have the big demand, which is coming from the industry players, your formal sector. You've got to have township SMEs, township entrepreneurs that you can grow and support. You also got to work with formal businesses, formal SMEs, right? And then you've got to bring in young people, and you've got to train them appropriately and place them into these SMEs. So these are the kinds of things that you've got to do. So you've got to adopt a culture of responsiveness to the demand for skills in those SMEs. And we believe, and this is part of our theory of change, which we're testing, not in 1 year, but in 4 years, that for every IRM SME that we work with in a township, right, we can create a minimum of 2 jobs, no matter how small or whatever they are. Obviously, if they're bigger, they move faster, we expand, but we're trying to set ourselves realistic objectives. Right? And this is the expression of that township ecosystem. So you've got the demand side here, where you've got to do a whole lot of inputs around those enterprises to get them to a point where they can realize their potential, their entrepreneurial potential. And these are the kinds of trade skills that you're talking about. But obviously, once you start linking those into the green economy, they open up new opportunities for them to use those skills in new ways with new innovations. And then on this side, you've got to do all the kinds of input with young people to equip them to become part of that growth of your entrepreneurs. But you also identify in that mix young people that have entrepreneurial potential themselves, and you can help them to incubate new businesses. So you start a new phase of emerging enterprises in that space. We're developing, as I said, these township hubs, which are set up to provide 4 sort of things: enterprise development support for acceleration of existing enterprises and incubation of new enterprises, digital platform to create market access, because that's the critical feature. How do you link the township business to the formal business? What is the mechanism? So you've got to bring the township business closer to the formal sector. You've got to bridge that gap, right? So setting up the digital platform that enables us to do that, and only once the township businesses get to the level where they are eligible for those opportunities can we link them. Then there's we call a maker space or a factory where you can do innovation, design, and manufacturing of products for households and infrastructure, etc. And the vocational skills development component to support upskilling, to support recognition of prior learning and trade testing of existing artisans in townships, as well as skilling of unemployed graduates who are coming through, and then the focus on green skills. Other way. So those interventions are tackling a whole lot of things for these SMEs. RPL and getting them qualified and recognized for the skills that they have, regulatory compliances, business development, finance, marketing, linkages with corporate and other value chains, operational excellence, and financial management and compliance. These are the kinds of elements that we got to address through the hubs, right? So it's an integrated set of support services. And the demand enablers, we believe, is that strategic linkages and networks to the partners in the local ecosystem. So again, that bridge between the township business and the formal sector company. How do we create that linkage, or into public infrastructure as well? The proximity to demand. So we want to have our hubs as close to where there's industrial activity as possible, so that we can create that linkage, and then the digital platform, as I said. And we will have 2 different types of SMEs broadly. Your early adopters, which are more likely to be formal, well-established SMEs, because they can train young people a lot quicker and employ people a lot quicker. So there's a much clearer business case for them. And then you've got your later adopters, who are your emerging SMEs, that will take a bit more time to get to the point. And we estimate anything up to 18 months to get an SME to a point where they are eligible, compliant, formalized, and are able to take on young people. So it's an investment in time. Some will move a lot quicker. Like we're doing a process in Ekurhuleni, we identified 10 SMEs that we're working there through our hub. Some are already starting to take on young people and train them and employ them. So some will move a lot quicker if they're really entrepreneurial and are really far down the road. Others might take a bit more time to get there. And then we note, as I said, I've got 2 more slides. Then the notion of this entrepreneurial ecosystem. So you've got to create an ecosystem. So besides the support that you're providing through the hub directly, there's a broader ecosystem within which you've got to bring all your stakeholders together. Your private industry, your public, your public buildings, and your NGOs and other sort of community organizations, and you've got to create an ecosystem that enables these things to happen, right? So how do you bring in different support mechanisms, whether it's for skilling, whether it's access to finance, networks, and markets, and then frame it all within that just transition framework. So when you spoke about what is just transition is about making sure that SMEs and young people in those communities, in this case anyway, I mean there's obviously broader sort of concepts, in this case, are benefiting from the growth and development of that industry and the greenification of that industry as it goes along. And the last thing to speak about is this is our skills training model that we've been running for the last few years, primarily in formal businesses, formal SMEs to date. And then as we grow the township SMEs, then we create more workplaces. But through support from GRZ and SECO and the Confederation of Danish Industries and other partners, private sector partners locally, and colleges, including our colleagues from Ekurhuleni East College, which is one of our pioneer colleges that we've been working with. We try and identify youth, those very youth that you spoke about that have fallen out of the schooling system, don't have to have matric. Ideally, they must have some technical background. If they've done an N2 or an N3 or whatever, then they have technical maths and science, which helps, but not pure maths and science necessarily. And maybe to be able to read a drawing would be great. You know, those sort of basic things, we can teach those, but if they come with those, it makes it a lot easier. You know. Then they must be unemployed, targeting unemployed. Right? Obviously, prioritization of women, so always with the gender equity component. So, in fact, in many of our programs, we have more women than men, and they actually outperform the men, just to say. Then we have selection criteria. One is proximity. We don't want to take young people who have to travel far to the workplace because they can't sustain it, especially when you're working on a stipend or a minimum wage. If you're paying like 50% of that towards transport, you're never going to sustain it. So you've got to live as close to the workplace as possible, like maximum 2 taxi rides, right? As I said, we ideally want them to have some kind of, they could come out of a technical high school, they could come out of a TVET college program, but they don't have to have completed that program. But that doesn't exclude out of school youth or, you know, matriculants who haven't necessarily done technical subjects. And then there's we can set other requirements. And then they go into a set of programs, and we're building the bank of programs. These are all registered skills programs, because people always ask me, are they accredited? Are they registered? No, so, because otherwise, you know, you don't get the piece of paper. So we make sure that they are registered. It takes time to register them. So some of them we start delivering even before they're registered, and then we have to RPL later, because you can't wait for the system. If you wait for the system, by the time you've registered the skills program, you know, then you've just made the situation worse. So we do go through a process with the Quality Council to register these skills programs, but it takes time. Sometimes it can take up to 2 years. By then, a whole lot of more young people have become unemployed. So we focus on some of your foundational skills, your preparation for work, occupational health and safety, working with power tools and equipment, reading and interpreting plans and drawings. And then we have the areas of specialization. Could be renewable energy, could be what we call the general repairer, which is our handy person, which is a big program, multi-skilled. In fact, 60% of our youth goes through the general repairer program, which is a multi-skilled person, could go into any household, office, hotel, whatever, and fix multiple things. We have plumbing, and we have electronics and appliance repair. We're still building some of these. Built into that is then your work readiness behaviors, so personal mastery, work socialization, and that, because we want to prepare them to go into the workplace, and not just any workplace, but a technical workplace, which is dirty, and you've got to stand all day, you've got to work with your hands. So how do we prepare them for all of that? And entrepreneurship education is integrated. All of that within a kind of a 3-month process. And we've delivered the plumbing one in particular very successfully with the Ekurhuleni East College. They've gone into plumbing SMEs, and we work very closely with the industry bodies to recognize this. So the Institute of Plumbing is our key industry partner, and then we have the Plumbing Industry Registration Board, and they recognize the program and help us to make sure that those kids get that recognition. Then they exit out of that, and they spend 6 to 9 months, ideally 9 months, but a minimum of 6 months in a SME doing structured workplace learning. As I said, to date, most of those have been formal SMEs. Increasingly, we're bringing new SMEs on board as we can grow them. And they do further training, they get coaching and mentoring and skills transfer from an artisan or an experienced technical person in that business, right? So we proper mentorship, proper structured training. Then they come back, and there's a summative assessment and certification, and where possible, we get them registered with a relevant industry body, and then we transition them Either they get retained by the business that they've been working in, or we will take them, if they are entrepreneurial, into a micro-enterprise incubation component, or they might go into further skills development. Many of them get access to apprenticeships and learnerships, and that's great. You know, nothing stopping that. So we're creating a pool. And you know, the labour market conditions are challenging. So yes, we've got to have, the one key thing, and then I'm finished, is we won't start training until we've got the workplace identified. Get the commitment from the employer signed and sealed before you start training. Because otherwise, you just sit with young people, you've raised their expectations, they sit at home for months while you're trying to find them a workplace. And we have had experience of that, made mistakes. Because otherwise the employers pull out or something happens. So have the employer signed and sealed up front before you start the training.
Thank you very much.